Welcome back to the Phil Lewis podcast, where we are back with another episode in which we're doing something a little bit different. In that in both the first half and the second half, I'm talking with the same practitioner. His name is Rupert Brown, and he's a Chief People Officer and HR consultant. Rupert has a genuinely insightful story to tell, one ultimately that is about what happens when the gulf between the things you need and what you expect of yourself and what the system in which you're working expects of you starts to feel too wide. In the first half then, we will get into that story in some detail. And then the second half, because Rupert is such an experienced consultant and has also written a great book about his experience, I thought it was appropriate to examine with him the many lessons from his story. So let's get straight into it. Here's my conversation with Rupert Brown. Rupert, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Great to see you, Phil.
So, what story have you got for us?
So let me take you back to 2005. Actually, quite a long time ago. I was working for the Gillette company. Young, early in my career, really enjoyed the environment I was in. I was actually in the UK at the time, and I was on one of those broadening assignments, as an HR guy who was interested in the business and was working in sales for a period of time. Driving up and down to see my customer up in Nottingham, a big retailer, and selling them more gift packs and deodorants and stuff. And I turned on the radio on the drive home and heard that my beloved Gillette was being acquired by Procter & Gamble. I heard it on the radio, and I was driving down the motorway, 60 mile an hour, and could not believe that this was how I was finding out that the company that I was really enjoying working for and had a lot of faith and confidence about the future, and therefore was taking this, this career gamble, was being acquired by, if you like, the big guy in the industry that had a reputation for being quite a difficult place to work.
I mean, we can kind of hit pause there in a sense, couldn't you? You could kind of go, if nothing else happened in the whole of that merger and acquisition process, and the only thing that you and I talked about for the next 20 minutes, whatever, was going to be just the fact that you found out while you were driving down the motorway at 60 miles an hour in your car. So keep going. So you're driving down the motorway and you find out about your companies being merged, acquired, whatever language you want to put around it, by P&G. What happens?
Yeah, I was very, clear that I needed to get back to HR. I was fascinated by mergers and acquisitions on the basis that I'd never experienced one before. So it was one of those professional, things that I wanted to do. So I wanted to get involved in the planning. I mean, the question I had in my mind was, how on earth are you going to combine these two juggernauts? I mean, I already thought Gillette was a large business. It was about $10 billion turnover, 40,000 people. In my mind, the largest company I'd ever seen at that stage in my career. P&G rocks up. It's 80 billion revenue, 110,000 people, and it's a monster eating a monster, effectively. So when the dust started to settle, and you can imagine most people's reactions were negative and scared about what the future held, I was curious, how on earth are we going to do this? What's this going to look like? How do you plan such an ordeal? So I was very keen to get back into HR and to be involved in that as much as possible. And I was fortunate that I got the opportunity to move back into HR, but into a more strategic location, so into Switzerland, in Geneva, where the two European head offices of the two businesses were about a mile apart from one another. And it's very much around, you can imagine the sort of things that are involved. It's organization design, it's the staffing, who's going to get the roles, it's relocation of people, it's benefits, harmonization and integration. It's a lot of actually the logical stuff that you do. It's planning, it's Excel, it's analysis. Until, of course, it comes to communication time, when all hell breaks loose, and that's when sort of the reality really hits.
Give us a sense of how it felt to actually be in the thick of that over that time.
Yeah, I think that the context you have to remember here as well is that you're in Switzerland, which typically is a foreign country to most of the people that live and work there, and they are there for the purpose of a job. So everything that is happening to those people sort of outside of the office, their very reason for being in that country, the family that they've got in tow, the arrangements they've made with the house back home, the kids' education, everything is dangling by the one thread, which is, what's my job? So that just puts a real heightened sense of stress around. I thought I was here for 3 years. Now you're telling me we're gonna do something else. What is the something else, and what's all the details that come with it? And some of that can range from if you could argue, the important. Is my job still in this country? Do I still have a job? Is it here? Do I have to relocate somewhere else? To is it a job I actually want to do? Is it convenient? Do I consider that career growth and development, etc.? So there's just a real heightened sense of concerns, both for the company, the business, the continuity, but everyone's really worried about themselves. And you've got to remember, when you're doing these HR roles, you're working on the business almost like it's a patient, but you also are one of the patients that's been worked on. And people rarely ask you how you're doing. It's like, so what do you know about your job security, your future? And of course, all I knew was my job was to do the integration planning, and then it was unknown. And in fact, there was one job that I thought I would really like to do, which was the Europe HR lead for Gillette inside the acquired business. That would be the logical job that I would have my eyes on. That job was taken. That was really given to somebody else. So now I really was in an overseas project capacity, future unknown. But actually, it's just the start of the story, really, for me, and where it takes me. But a really fascinating call with my manager at the time, who said, P&G like what they've seen, Rupert. That was a really good piece of work. We can offer you, we can't offer you the job in Switzerland, but we can offer you Boston, Cincinnati, or Singapore, Kuala Lumpur as next steps. And like, you're looking at them thinking, I don't even know where half those places are. It's like, so really having to hit the pause button and say, this, I just feel like I've just been pulled up into an alien world, where international relocation is par for the course. But my understanding of the terrain and what I'm getting myself into is totally unknown. So I was flattered, but had to then go away and do a bit of research. And I think the flattery piece is an interesting reflection. How often do we say yes to things on the basis of trust, just flattered that we've been asked to do them? So, but I felt actually in a quite a sort of vulnerable position at this point. So I was with my girlfriend at the time. We weren't married at that point. She'd followed me to Switzerland because we wanted that sort of international life. She had to put her career on hold in order to do that, because in Switzerland you can't do a UK job from there. And then all of a sudden, I was sort of like, spinning the globe and deciding where to go next, dragging poor Helen along to wherever that might be. So there was a lot to consider all at once, and it felt like a very sort of grown-up choice to make with very little information. It's like, no, actually, what do I want next for the career and the family?
I mean, the other thing about these sort of change and transformation processes sometimes, of course, is that because the momentum is so high on them, that itself kind of keeps people going. And it's only later that the kind of emotional stuff really comes out.
Yeah. So, and the emotions stayed bottled up and did not pay attention to them for a long time. In fact, it's probably only in the writing of the book in the last 2 years that I've stopped and thought about this period of time. And you're right, there's so much to do, and you're both sort of motivated and inspired to be doing interesting work, flattered that someone's actually giving you the responsibility for doing it, and you're in the thick, and you're often sort of like swallowing down the questions about yourself. I remember vividly the New Year's Eve party that year when we'd just gone live, and January 1 was the first year of the tax year, and so when you work overseas, often you form quite tight social bonds, which can also be very awkward, because especially when you're trying to work with change and these people are in your community. So we're at a New Year's Eve party, and it's essentially all the Gillette gang, and someone's complaining to me about the selection process for how people get jobs, and then just slips into the conversation, so what are you doing next year? It's like, I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing next year. Their reaction looking at me was, Oh my God, I've just come up to you on New Year's Eve to complain about something arbitrary and my own sort of woes, and I've totally forgotten that there's another human involved here, in this case in the HR function. And I think that's often a plight the HR folks find themselves with. You know, they might be the ones switching off the lights at the end of a closure or a shutdown or something. And like a lot of leaders, they're so in service of everybody else that they put themselves last.
Talk to me about how you then navigated through that. I mean, by the sounds of it, some stuff went well, some stuff will have gone less well. You've got your own situation and emotions to manage. Talk to us about what was the kind of strategy to keep going. What was the strategy to survive and thrive through that situation?
So that it was very, very logical self-talk kind of approach. So definitely emotions were, and I to this day I find it hard to switch on the ability to label emotions accurately. You know, I have to really sort of, it's like trying to find reverse in an old manual car. You've really got to try and select that gear a few times, I find. And my self-talk was all around, this is great for your career. You just found yourself in the midst of the biggest deal the industry's ever seen. You're getting your expat experience. You're right in the thick of everything. This is good for you. You know, it's that self-talk of this is good for you. Keep going. And I remember a couple of times having calls with my brother actually on the telephone to say, "This is good for me, and I am hating it, or I am missing my old company. I am finding this place totally alien." But there was very few people you could have the conversation with because you also realized that on this treadmill, great opportunities were presenting themselves. So so when I left Switzerland, it was to go to Singapore, a part of the world I'd never worked in before, and quickly came to really enjoy and appreciate. And all of a sudden, the family system starts taking over. So in Singapore, a lot happens for us personally. You know, we get married, we have our first child, we have our second child. My grandmother passes away. I turn 30. So within a very short period of time, you've sort of gone from you feel like the lucky youngster who got a break to all of a sudden the young adult with a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. And when is the right time, when you've got family in tow living overseas on the other side of the world, when is the right time to say, hey, you know what, this doesn't really suit me anymore? And the realization was having to do a lot of sort of change leadership work where I was as the HR leader for that business in that part of the world. My essentially my reason for being there was to keep the business momentum going and keep the Gillette employees retained, keep them on the bus. So I was doing an awful lot of sort of town halls and workshops around, you can imagine change curves. How do you culturally assimilate into the new organization? What skills do you need, etc., etc. And there came a point where I realized the gap between what I was saying and what I believed was just becoming so wide um, that it was sort of like just building up in front of me, inside of me, and starting to cause a problem. And funnily enough, it came out in the strangest way. So, in the third year of that assignment, we were going to do a corporate 10K run. Well, you've probably seen them around. And each year, normally the organization arranges branded T-shirts, and everybody goes down in a bus. You all do the fun run together. You have a few beers after. That year, the T-shirts hadn't arrived, so as we were waiting for the bus, someone said, we're all wearing our normal sort of like running gear. Someone said, "Well, why don't we write the company name on our shoulders in this black Sharpie pen, this black marker? So then at least we know where we're all from." It's like, okay, that's great. So everyone's writing PG on the shoulders and passing the pen around. And the pen comes to me, and I reach up, and I can't write the letters on my arm. I can't write PG on my arm. It's like, that's not my brand. My brand is Gillette. So I write G and pass the pen on. And this is 3 years, it's actually 4 years post the moment on the motorway. So a lot of water has gone under the bridge, but it's this sort of realization Wow, I actually, I actually really miss the old place, and the gap between what I'm sort of saying, what I'm advocating, and what I'm feeling is becoming so large. I need to do something about this, and I think a lot of leaders, whatever they're doing, they find themselves with that gap. It's almost like an authenticity gap, I suppose, but it takes a while before you can do anything about it.
It's so interesting listening to you talk though, because there's this really striking conversation you're having with your brother, which is, it's good for me, it's good for me, it's good for me, like the self-talk, it's good for me, it's good for me, and I hate it. And then so it feels that there's a lot of unprocessed stuff there, and you've been carrying a lot as well by the sounds of it. I mean, if you look at as we talked about earlier on, really, the burdens on people in HR in times of change and transformation can be vast. So you're carrying a lot and you're holding a lot for other people as well, because it's the nature of that role that people will bring their uncertainty to you. They'll bring their dissatisfaction to you. They'll bring their anxiety to you. And, there's a kind of holding that needs to happen. And then suddenly you get this moment where it's like, I'm required to write something on my arm, the most sort of, in a way, the most kind of poxy thing, right? I mean, and you can't do it. I'm reminded of a Morrissey lyric, the gulf between all the things I need and the things I receive is an ancient ocean, wild, lost, uncrossed, and it's like suddenly there is this sort of huge gap between where you are and where you want to be in that sense. And how did you deal with that? What happened?
Well, I'm not sure I did deal with it, Phil. So, you keep plugging up, keep plugging away. When is it go back to on paper? You talk to your friends and say everything on paper is perfect. You've got a brilliant job, this amazing company. That company is a company you don't get to join unless you get acquired or you're fortunate enough to be recruited from a stellar university. So you're living the dream, as my friend kept saying. You're living the dream. You're working in Singapore as an expat. You've got 2 beautiful kids. Great wife, great social life, great work. Surely nothing's wrong. There is that, and I suppose it just quietly eats you up inside. And a lot of what happens with with these change programs is that, I mean, I actually stayed 5 years post acquisition, which basically meant that the majority of the people I joined with had left, and I was actually one of the last people to leave. So I had almost passing of the baton, turning the lights off kind of feeling, and that sort of sadness of the end really has ended kept coming back for me. It took a long time to extract myself from it though, because I was quite precarious. There I was on the other side of the world with a visa that said Procter and Gamble on it, and the minute that stops, I've got to go and sort my life out. That's an inconvenient truth, and I think a lot of us, and me included, you just kick the ball down the road.
And Rupert, looking back at it now, were there moments then along that process? You mentioned driving down the motorway and suddenly hearing that your company was being acquired, and then you give us the metaphor of a few years later kind of switching the lights off. Were there moments where looking back you go, actually, that was when that gulf between what I believed and what I was required to do just got bigger and bigger and bigger? I mean, can you isolate specific incidences which had a contribution to that overall feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that marker pen moment was the moment, because it was the emotion it brought to me for the first time was I felt like a fraud. I felt like I'd been saying one thing, and then now for myself I can't do it. So I've been advocate of cultural assimilation and advocate doing all the things, but it was very performative. It was very, sure, pick up the new skills, but for me, reluctantly, almost like as a survival mechanism. And I think it was just building over time, and it sort of needed some kind of mirror to be put in front of me that said, actually, this is not sustainable. So you can tell yourself that the next job will be good for you too. But at some point you have to confront the fact that it's sort of eating you from the inside out. And there were a few steps involved to sort of, if you like, getting myself removed. And repatriation was one of those important steps. So, now I was 2 assignments and 4 years out of the UK. I needed to be sent home, as it were. And there's logistical headaches to be done with that.
It's very symbolic, that, isn't it? The idea of sort of
Yeah.
repatriation in the context that you're just describing, that thing around, I ultimately needed to come back home because what I hear in your story is a huge amount of alienation, actually. And clearly, by the sounds of it, there was a lot of good things for you in living in Singapore and your young family and all the rest of it. But at the same time, there's this sense of listening to you talk, there's this sense of somebody who actually is feeling very kind of isolated and very out on a limb and, not connected to the organization or indeed in some sense the kind of possibly therefore the kind of stuff you want to actually be doing, so that
Right.
repatriation point feels more than just practical in a way.
Yes, I think it's a fascinating point that you raise. And for us as well, repatriation meant to where? So you might call the UK home, but we didn't have a house to move into. We didn't have obvious schools for the kids to go to. So I'm from the Yorkshire. We were growing up in southwest London, I guess. Where's home? So I guess you follow the work. You go and get yourself in the sort of London conurbation and take it from there. But we had to sort of figure out a place that we could call home. And when we got there, of course, the Gillette I'd left was no longer there. It was now a Procter and Gamble. It was a different office, different location, some familiar faces, maybe one or two, but a very different culture and vibe. So the belonging piece that you describe, actually, I hadn't thought about this, but it's a theme that runs throughout. Because you also realize that when you work overseas, you're working on a visa. You are a foreigner, and a lot of the times cultures have a way of reminding you of that fact. So then coming back to the UK and sort of feeling like a foreigner in your own country is a strange thing. And I was fortunate to get repatriation sort of counselling. It's one of the services that they offered at the time. And I was curious, well, what is this? What will they cover? And she said, one of the first things she said, Rupert, people aren't interested in your stories. They don't want to know what you did when you were overseas. All they want to know is that you're home now and you're going to fit back in. And it was like it was like I can't unsee. I can't. Do you know what I mean? Those years abroad were the most stimulating and rich and
I'm sorry,
developing
I really feel the
conversations.
need to kind of like as a sort of working coach and someone who's done, you know, um psychotherapy, foundational psychotherapy qualifications and everything else. I feel the real need to kind of I feel like I want to stage an intervention on behalf of your younger self when you tell me that. I'm like, repatriation counseling, which is basically kids suck it up, no one cares, is not exactly the kind of hopefully empathic, if I'm understanding you correctly, the kind of empathic counseling that you would hope somebody who's returning from what has actually been quite a bruising experience in a number of different ways would be receiving. Am I wrong?
I'm glad you say that, Phil. I was a bit taken aback by it as well. And I think I probably, I don't know if that was the only thing, but I responded to that as, yeah, you're probably right. I'm not actually ready to be home either. I remember we had this distinct feeling when we got to the airport, when we got to Heathrow and tried to get the bags off the carousel. I remember how heavy they felt. Not in a 20 kg heavy, but I really don't want to take those bags off the carousel. I really don't want to be here. I'm not ready to repatriate. And it's like all the signals I was getting was maybe this isn't actually your time either. And funny enough, 3 years later, I'm back in Singapore working for somebody else. Um, there was lots of sort of signs and signals, and who knows? I mean, we can look back on them and say, yeah, the thread was there, but in some ways, the repatriation was the hardest because you're trying to reconcile everything that you know about your home country, plus all these new things that you've seen and done.
It's a fascinating story. Starting going down the motorway, driving at 60 miles an hour, suddenly hearing your company's being acquired, throwing yourself into HR, doing years worth of work then to support and manage that integration. At the same time, moving out of the country to do that. And at the same time, this kind of gulf that starts to open up between what you believe and what you're being required to do. Your story contains a huge number of resonances and a huge number of things that we can get into. And I'm looking forward to getting into them with you in just a moment. Rupert, there are a huge number of themes in that story, I think, from themes of jeopardy and survival to the dehumanization of large corporates and the challenges of working in people related disciplines when you have literally hundreds of thousands of people to manage. There are themes of belonging. There are themes of the deals that we make with ourselves. There are themes of loss. Really interesting stuff, I think, in that story as well about the metaphors we use. I mean, I was really struck by listening to you talk about monsters and treadmills and all those sorts of things as well. So a lot for us, I think, to dive into and examine in terms of what that story actually has to teach. As you look back on it and you think through that time in your career, what is your sort of principal reflection?
Yeah, if I say what did I take away, it's the failure to recognize the person in the broader sense and the role of emotions in change. Those two things. So you might say it leads me to a more human-centered approach, if we want to use this sort of jargon, to how we do things. And then I also recognize that's really hard to do on a practical basis. But those are the two sort of key learnings, if you like, and that's very much applicable to lots of leaders, lots of HR people, lots of change scenarios. And change is not just the thing at work, is it? It's not just the process change, the technology. It's the passing of a relative. It's the getting married. It's the having children. It's the sense of distance. There's so much going on for an individual, and even a very empathetic leader or line manager can only scratch the surface, but needs to make the attempt, I think, to understand the fuller person to try and make it as effective as possible.
I mean, listening to your story, I was really struck by, I mean, frankly, how young you were as well. And, you know, you were what, in your 20s when all this was going on. And I think back to who I was in my 20s. I was actually talking to somebody about this at dinner a couple of nights ago and going, you could give me all the money in the country and I would not go back to being in my 20s in any way, shape or form. Partly because I just in my own sort of life, and I guess it's different for different folks and we all have different life experiences, don't we? But you know, my sense of being in my 20s was I just didn't know still who I was. You know, it took me until I was really in my early 30s to kind of crack that. But my experience of being in my 20s, I don't know if this resonates with yours as well, is that fairly quickly in the world of work, because I was quite a high performer, I was thrown into environments in which I was completely ill-equipped to cope with retrospect, right? And I was required to, in my case, I was going into like procurement meetings with major multiples, you know, in the UK. So, you know, you go and sit with these absolute bulldogs who worked for Sainsbury's or whatever and, you know, get your arse handed to you in these meetings. And they were all really experienced. And I was just frankly, a kid trying to do a job, you know, and so what you develop in those sorts of situations, I think, is a very good game face. That was what one of my coping strategies in those moments was, okay, well, there's armor that I need to put on here, and it's this armor that's going to help me to survive in this environment that, quite frankly, is not that interested in my survival, let alone me doing particularly well, you know. And so a habit starts getting formed in my own case there, which is starting to work out that in order to be successful at work, I actually fundamentally need to put some armor on and need to actually start being somebody who I'm not and parroting things I don't believe and all the rest of it that I think your story really brings up. And it is only many, many years later when I start doing some proper personal development work and I start looking back at that, and it's a process of rediscovering my own humanity at work. Right. And then you get interested, I think, or I got interested in all the ways in which we lose our own humanity. But I recognized that about myself as well. And it was a natural response to the pressures that I was under in that environment. I don't know if that resonates with you at all, but it really came up for me listening to your story, you know.
Yeah, I wouldn't take any of it back. You know, I think I developed an awful lot sort of professionally, and a lot of maturity came from that. It's funny what you say though about doing that. I call it the inner work or the serious personal development. There is no, and my question is, when is there the time? I don't mean time, but when is the opportunity to do that well. What surprised me, Phil, was this came to me really in the writing of the book in the last 2 years. I thought I was going to be writing about my experiences of the last 5 years. And what I realized was what had shaped me was the experiences 20 years prior. So it was only when I did the work that I saw the red thread, and I recognized that actually what's made you an empathetic leader is the fact that you had your emotions, if you like, shaken by this experience and didn't tend to them at the time either. Because all you want to do at that age is earn money, earn more money. So you run straight from one harrowing experience to the next, hopefully charging a higher buck. And I was doing that repeatedly, and also throwing in other variables. I kept changing industry, kept changing country. So it wasn't like it was a simple go next door and repeat what you'd learned. It was I kept all like doubling up. So if you like, when I had to play catch up, I had quite a deficit to get through, quite a lot of material to unpack.
I mean, listening to your this is where I feel very affronted by that repatriation counselling that you had, because, you know, that very striking phrase, no one cares about your stories. I'm like, the one thing that we should care about is the stories. It's like the way into helping people at work is not to ask, why are you behaving as you're behaving? It's what happened to you? What's gone on for you in your life? What's gone on for you in your work? And how has that informed the way that you're showing up right now? And I think about listening to you talk, and you talk about being an empathetic leader. And it strikes me that having that experience of feeling that gulf opening up between what you believe and what you're required to do, for example, knowing what that's like, understanding, having some insight into the emotional consequences of that is integral to successful leadership. It reminds me of I'm paraphrasing Carl Jung here, but you know, it's our wounds that give us the measure of our power to heal. You know, it's the things that we go through, it's the stories, it's the injuries that we sustain through the experiences we have in the end that actually allow us to be of service to others. And it sounds like the experience that you will have had there, both practically but also emotionally, has been quite formative for you in terms of being able to move on and, you know, perform well as a leader since then.
Yeah, I wonder also if I tell myself that. And somebody asked me the other day, I was looking at an opportunity, and someone said, "You don't like easy things, do you?" You know, why do you always get the difficult things and the difficult people and the difficult places? Why are you somehow drawn like a moth to difficult change scenarios? And maybe it's because I tell myself I also believe in the role of experience in forming character. I want medals and war wounds more than I want just getting along and fitting in, which maybe is what my sort of repatriation counselor was trying to advise. It's almost like the quickest way to just getting back into where you left is just to suck it up. But of course, maybe she misdiagnosed what my definition of success actually was, and I would not have been able to explain that at the time. But I think it's funny what we tell ourselves about what success looks like and the sort of person we want to be.
Well, it's interesting though, isn't it? I mean, the other half of that repatriation advice wasn't just no one cares about your stories. It was basically all they want to know is that you're going to shut up and comply and fit in. I mean, I'm paraphrasing partly through the lens of my own quite strong value judgment on that piece of input, you know. But nevertheless, that is the spirit of what you recounted, was basically, you know, effectively be a good boy, you know. Now, another interesting nuance, I think, in the story that you told us, I mean, you mentioned on 2 or 3 occasions that thing around, God, it all felt very adult. It all felt very, you know, I was listening to you, and again, I could relate through the lens of my own 20s to that maybe, and thinking, God, I just feel so out of my depth here, and all these people are really sophisticated, and, you know, they've all got better suits than me and all the rest of it. I'm just sort of awkward kid trying to work out how to sort of make it in the world of work and all the rest of that, you know. And I wonder about that, and I wonder about, you know, for you, in terms of the work you've then gone on to do, how you obviously have some sense of what a lonely place that is to be, and you have some sense of how challenging it is to kind of go through issues like that when you are in the early part of your career. How well do you see organizations respond to that? Do you think it's something that the world of work acknowledges in some way, shape, or form? Do you think that the knocks we take in our 20s is just part of the human condition, and we all just have to kind of suck it up and get on with it to a point? I mean, what's your sort of take on it now through the lens of a few more years down the road?
It's an interesting question, and if you think about how we do talent management in corporations, we often have models of experiences people should have before climbing the ladder, and it's almost like a tick box exercise. You should start something up, you should shut something down, you should do something complicated, you should do something hard, you should, all these sort of like all the different things you should do before you become. And there's a danger, actually, I think, that you internalize that, you buy that story. It might be the model that you apply internally, but what's the sort of the model you're applying to yourself? And I think I was definitely guilty a little bit of living the career plan, and taking that really sort of literally. So my career goal very early on was rise to the top of this function, be a chief people officer of a meaningful organization, and then do everything. And in my case, mobility was on my side. Do everything to make that a global company and a global experience, and sort of go see the world. And my identity is very linked to that, and I'm conscious my identity is still linked to that. So the first 3 letters on my LinkedIn profile say Chief People Officer. I actually don't do that job per se today. I'm taking that experience to apply it more reflectively into how I consult and advise. But for 25 years, my life plan, my career plan were the same plan. And I sort of like doggedly went after that. And I think there's a huge risk. There's a really huge risk there. We need to get a bit more enlightenment, I think, into the sort of the personal planning process.
Well, also, it's a great point. And also, the themes of survival really come through in that, don't they? I mean, if you think about your own story, you've got life in Singapore, which is predicated on you having the sponsorship to underpin a visa. You've got the nature of having to provide for a young family and the financial responsibilities one would assume comes with that. You've also got then the question of your own self-identity. And the way that the sort of self-images that we have when they get threatened, that is a form of survival threat. It's basically kind of form of egoic threat, effectively. Right. So you've got that going on as well. And then, of course, the other thing about your story, which is super interesting, is you've got that going on in some way, shape, or form to varying degrees with varying kind of tones on the Pantone reference chart across 100,000 plus employees. All of that is in play around the time that you've got this change and transformation going on. Now, an organization doesn't have either the bandwidth or the capital or whatever else, even a very well-resourced one, to put everybody into 20 years worth of deep therapy around all of that. But at the same time, what we do see a lot of the time, and you were talking to earlier on, is the fact that actually the steamroller of the transformation is kind of going ahead, and we're not even really thinking about people in any kind of humanistic sense at all. Your book's called Lost in Transformation, and I wonder if that is one of the things that often gets lost, is that sense of actually, human beings, feelings, thoughts, lived experiences. There's that word sonder, isn't there, which is that if we start looking at everybody else who walks around the world, and we understand the fact that they have internal lives that are as rich and dynamic and varied and multidimensional as our own, and that is also true in organizational life clearly as well. So talk more about Lost in Transformation, and is that one of the themes that comes through then, that sort of very kind of humanistic take on transformation?
That's exactly right. It is a humanistic thing. And, when I started going down the different rabbit holes that you do when you research a book, I realized about the importance of character, both from a sort of a leadership perspective, but also how you drive change, how you get followership. It goes back to Aristotle's rhetoric. How do you influence people? But I was actually reflecting on what's the sort of person I want to become. And, you know, I guess I've been fortunate that I've worked around some very impressive um, leaders. And I use the word impressive because there's different attributes of them that impressed me. So you might, for example, in the P&G example, you get very global citizen type, very smooth, multilingual, global citizen type of leaders who seem unflappable. That impressed me in one sense. I then did quite a bit of time in private equity and worked with ultra high net worth individuals who have a seeming ability to sort of skate over the surface of any situation and know the right people in the right places to get big things happening. That's kind of impressive. But there was often I struggled to find somebody who sort of was on the surface and below the surface, congruent with what I wanted to be. And funny enough, my role model was my father, to say somebody who was successful and a good person who people wanted to spend time with and would recognize that he was interested in how other people were. So I think it's very rare actually to find somebody who is both successful and interested, and not just for sort of Machiavellian reasons. So for me, there's a big chapter in the book around character, and in some ways it's a bit out of place, because I've read many books on leadership. I've not read much on character, but for me it was almost like, the missing ingredient in many ways was, what sort of person do you want to become? Because there's lots of different ways to earn money. There's lots of different ways to drive change, to lead organizations. But for me, I'm very clear that the human side, the empathetic side, even doing difficult things that not everybody will enjoy, but doing them well, that is everything. That's what it's all about.
That's absolutely spot on. And you're right. I mean, we don't talk about character a lot in business, do we? And, you mentioned earlier on about character forming experiences. And again, I'm brought back to the conversation that you were having with yourself and those around you. This is good for me. This is good for me. And in a sense, right, character is formed by, or at least part formed by, actually the stress and pain that we put ourselves through and that we are able to tolerate and can in some sense kind of go on from and grow from. Right. Human beings generally get stronger from the things that they can bear if they are then supported to process those things in the right way. But I'm really struck by that point about character. I don't know if your take on it's the same as mine, but I look back over my own career and I think about what I would consider to be character forming moments, and they've often been what I would call kind of inflection points in retrospect. You've got a choice really, which is, do you go left, do you go right, or do you do this thing or do you not? And, in your case, again, it's really interesting, that point around having to write P&G on my arm and I can't do it. That even strikes me as quite a symbolic decision point about, am I prepared to really go all in on something I don't actually buy, or am I not? So I think you get these moments in careers. My sense of it anyway is that we get these points where we are confronted with decisions, and the we can't necessarily know the outcomes of those decisions, and we never know the counterfactuals. You never get to make the same decision twice in the same circumstances, but decisions ultimately, like if you come to the sort of psychotherapy take on it or psychology take on it, no one gets away with anything ever. That ultimately, if we make decisions that are not necessarily driven by, and again, I don't want to get too moralistic, but good moral impulse, if we want to just sort of talk about it in those senses, that in some way actually it kind of comes back to haunt us. So I'm interested in these moments of inflection we get and the role that has in forming character. And actually I look back at my own career and think, well, sometimes you did not make good choices. Sometimes you did not do the right thing in that circumstance. And I've paid for that quite dearly in some circumstances when I've done it. But I consider that to be part of character forming stuff as well, because there's been some degree of healthy reflection processing around that, I hope. So I don't know if your take's the same as mine, but yeah, that question of character feels really, really insightful and really relevant.
Well, you made me look at that situation differently, actually, Phil, because the sense I had at the time was a sense of rebellion. It was a sense of, I'm not P&G, I am Gillette. That's my story. That's my brand. So it's funny enough that if you like, when I went back to repatriation, being told that your stories don't matter, my character was saying your stories matter. And being sort of, if you like, corporate whitewashed and, oh, you're being acquired now. It's been 5 years. Surely you're one of us. Oh, you're not one of us. Surely you failed on the integration journey. I don't buy that at all. And often we say, when you go into organizations that have had rounds and rounds of acquisitions, and the first thing people say when they introduce themselves is, hi, I'm Tony. I'm from company X that you acquired 19 years ago. And people joke, oh, that's a sign of failure. That's a sign of sort of cultural, poor M&A or poor cultural assimilation. It's like, no, that's his story. That's his brand. That's the most important thing. And it was rebellion. And I think that does come back to, I'm the third son. I'm the youngest. I got to play out my rebellious impulses, and I think that's so we can call it character. Character is also some of those things that are there are our edges. They might not be the things that are always sensible. There might have been a better solution there, which was to suck it up and stay on the corporate conveyor belt a bit longer. But it was becoming impossible, incongruous, I suppose, for my character. It was revealing itself. I didn't know that at the time. Thank you for drawing that connection.
Again, you talk about the corporate conveyor belt. It's a bit like when you talk about a treadmill. I'm reminded of what my friend Rupert said to me years ago. He said, Phil, you can win the rat race, but you'll still be a rat. Which I think we could all spend some degree of time meditating on if we wanted, I think, talk a little bit about your book because there is a lot in it. It's a really interesting, not only walk through your own career, but also some very useful kind of leadership lessons. So what inspired you to write it? I think that would be the first question I have. And secondly, what are you hoping that it will help other leaders to think, feel, do?
Yeah. So the origin story, I guess, this would be a different story for a different podcast, but it was essentially coming out of a very well resourced transformation program with some of the brightest people I'd ever worked with, following some of the well trusted and documented methodologies of change, and finding ourselves essentially in a civil war. With the feuding sides being, if you like, the legacy organization we're trying to transform, and myself on the other side as the arrogant transformation consultants with all the ideas and all the answers. And I came out of the piece of work really scratching my head. It's kind of like, in theory, that was all of the best practice that we have on that project. That was every consultancy you can think of, every decent company the last 20 years was represented, and still we got to civil war. And I was like, how on earth? What's going on here? It's almost like it's just not working. And why is it not working? And I wanted to do some research as part of the writings. It wasn't just reflection and literature review. It was also, speaking to people who I thought were actually quite good at leading in change. I interviewed over 30 people. And what really struck me was the way they talk about it is very logical, very process, almost like the Kotter steps of a change program. And there was very little talk of the role of emotions, and very little, people were not willing to be vulnerable at all when they talk about leadership. So I thought that's interesting, and it's going to probably require then me to be the vulnerable one. I'll have to go first here and recount some of my experiences. And it was in that journey that I got to, oh yeah, it probably was actually Singapore where, the wheels came off the bus. So the book really has helped to sort of like bring that into sharp focus, and then put some ideas around how we can actually navigate change and leadership. And I also poke a bit of fun at it, to be honest, Phil, because we do put ourselves on pedestals, and I think that just makes it so much harder to do. So we do need to be a bit more lighthearted about it. And some of the biggest insights for me actually came more from philosophy and sort of the some elements of psychology, so whether that's transactional analysis or whether that's the way that people actually communicate with one another. These were in my sort of, as a generalist HR person, I might have known they existed, but I hadn't done enough time learning about them.
Really interesting. I mean, you're talking to somebody here whose own approach to change is basically deal with the emotions first, and then the change will take care of itself. Like fundamentally, I think we're in an emotional management role when we're leading and managing change in any way, shape, or form. But it's also interesting, and I perhaps one for a conversation for another time, because you kind of alluded to it. But when change and transformation goes wrong, we think back to the story you've told us today about being out in Singapore and everything that was in play then for you around the, questions of identity, questions of belonging, questions of communication, how effectively that was being done, questions of support, the get over it repatriation story you told us, questions of, jeopardy and survival and loss and all sorts of stuff comes out in that story. And that is the stuff that feels to me like it is in play in almost any change process that we would care to name, really, whether in big ways or small ways. And again, different strokes for different folks. We all have different ways of relating to the world and different, levels of, I don't know, security and all that kind of thing. But yeah, a lot in that. And which kind of brings me to rounding out, because one of the things I like to do with guests as we get to the end of these episodes is try and capture a couple of lessons for our listeners, and or at least a couple of points of reflection. And I do find myself, and I found it throughout the time talking to you over the course of this podcast, sort of wanting to go back to your 20-year-old sort of 20-odd-year-old self and give him a big hug, actually, is kind of my emotional response to your story, which may say more about me than about the 20-odd-year-old. But it is that thing of taking care of the emotions first. The other thing that really strikes me, and your story about your point about character makes this really well, and I think your story illuminates beautifully, is this question around what are the deals that we make with ourselves, and when actually are we making necessary sacrifices in terms of a desired future state, and when actually might we be, in the old parlance, kind of selling our soul or going a bit beyond what future us would actually be grateful to us for having done. And that feels very, very resonant and present in the story that you shared with us today. How about you? What do you, having had this conversation this morning, what feels most alive for you in terms of things we can leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I'm if I could go back in time, it would have been you described the giving the hug. For me, it was the being able to label. I mean, I'm still very bad at it today. But the labeling of the emotion and having the conversation around that, over and above the very, very strong self-talk that I have, in a way, that would have been that was the skill I wish I'd learned earlier. And it took some really deep reflection and time off the treadmill, to go back to that analogy, to realize that's what was missing. And I think that actually the beauty of that is that it's right in front of us. It's with us all the time. So it's you haven't missed an opportunity. You've got an opportunity right now to do something with that perspective and with that insight. And I'm very positive. I mean, I'm very pro leadership and pro change. I know a lot of people in my space throw rotten tomatoes at leaders and change, and it's like, well, no, this is happening, guys, whether we like it or not. The only question is, can we do this any better? And that's where I actually feel very sort of resourceful and excited about. There's myriad of different ways that we can actually bring all this insight and all this data to bear, so we can have much better outcomes for everybody.
Well, for what it's worth, I think it's of real credit to you that you've done that internal work and you've gone in search of those answers inside, as much as by interviewing others and trying to understand their perspectives as well. It's still a rarer thing in leadership than perhaps it might be, that ability to kind of look within and even just things like naming emotions and labeling them. I mean, you say that's something that you haven't found to be necessarily easy. Frankly, don't think it's something that any of us have found particularly easy. I'm reminded in one of our last episodes, one of the coaches we were talking to was talking about the Pixar movie Inside Out.
Yeah.
And there's this wonderful transition moment, isn't there, when actually all the adult emotions come into play, and they're just so complicated, and there's so many of them, and God knows how do you disentangle them. But it's never anything other than a productive line of inquiry, in my view. So, Rupert, thank you for coming on today. Thank you for sharing your story and taking us through what it was like to be driving down a motorway and then your Singaporean adventures. We will put links to your book in the show notes to this podcast, along with LinkedIn profile and anywhere else that people can find you online. But in the meantime, thank you very much for an interesting conversation.
Thank you, Phil. Pleasure.
A huge thanks there to Rupert for a conversation that was equal parts insightful and inspiring. There was a lot in that conversation that any of us who are trying to lead well through change would do well to reflect on. We'll be back next month. But in the meantime, if you found value in this podcast, we would, as always, be very grateful if you could leave us a rating, leave us a review, subscribe, or even share it with somebody who you think would find value in it. The podcast is still relatively young, so any and all support goes a really long way into making this little labour of love sustainable. In the meantime, we'll be back next month, and I look forward to more conversations on the Phil Lewis podcast. Bye for now.